She left an acre of the richest ground on her farm untouched, not because she forgot it, not because she ran out of time. She drove past it on purpose, 3 times, while every other field in the county was already turned black and ready for seed. Men leaning on a fence a quarter-mile off watched her do it and couldn't make sense of what they were seeing. Ruby Calloway was 20 years old, 5'4", hair tucked under a cap gone soft at the brim from 2 seasons of sweat. Her hands had calluses that didn't belong on someone that young, the kind you only get from running a tractor alone, season after season, with no one to hand the wheel to when you got tired. She didn't explain her decisions to anyone. She made them, and then she did the work that followed. Before her father's heart turned on him, evenings on the Calloway porch had a rhythm to them. James would talk through the day's work while Ruby scraped mud off her boots on the bottom step, and the talk wasn't really about farming. It was about the two of them still being a family, still doing this together, the way they'd done it since her mother passed when Ruby was 9. That porch had been the one steady place in a hard life. It didn't feel steady anymore. 2 winters back, James's heart gave out enough that the hard work fell to Ruby alone. She didn't make a production of it. She just started doing more, feeding stock before dawn, running equipment she'd only ever helped with before, making decisions her father used to make without asking him first because she could see what it cost him to be asked. Then, last winter, going through the equipment shed for parts, she found a cardboard box gone soft with water damage, and inside it, her grandfather's notebooks. Earl Calloway had farmed that same ground decades before her, and he hadn't just kept records of yields. He'd sketched water patterns after storms. He'd written about which corners of the farm dried out fast and which stayed wet for weeks. And in one notebook from the mid-1960s, a single passage Ruby had read so many times she nearly had it memorized. The rough strips along the creek, the ones everyone said were too wet to bother plowing, were the ones that slowed the water down when it came. She measured out 60 feet along Cane Branch Creek, the worst flooding stretch on the whole farm, the ground that cost the family more lost yield than anywhere else on the property, and she left it standing in grass. When her father asked her about it, she didn't mention soil conservation bulletins or vegetative buffers. She just said, "Grandpa Earl left these strips for a reason, and I think I know what it was." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Whatever was coming that spring, she was about to find out if a dead man's handwriting could be trusted over 40 years of common sense. April came in wet, the way it usually does in the Tennessee lowlands. 3 hard rains in the first 2 weeks, nothing the county hadn't seen 100 times. But Ruby was watching something nobody else thought to watch. After every rain, before she did anything else, she walked the creek edge of that low field. She noted how far the water had crept, where it pulled, what it carried. Each time the same thing happened. The water hit the edge of her unplowed strip, lost speed, and spread sideways instead of pushing straight up into her planted rows. The pale, heavy silt that hardened like concrete when it dried, the silt every farmer in the basin dreaded, was dropping out at the boundary of the grass instead of crossing her field. She didn't tell anyone what she was seeing. She wrote it down in the same battered notebook she used for everything, her observations sitting next to her grandfather's in the same plain shorthand he'd used 60 years before. Once, in early May, Burl Simmons drove past on his tractor and called out something that sounded like a joke about weeds. Ruby waved and kept walking the line. Something was building in her, quiet and steady, not pride exactly, more like watching numbers slowly resolve into an answer. But it was only May. The real test hadn't come yet. The forecast turned in the second week of June. A slow-moving system stalled over Arkansas, pulling moisture up from the Gulf in long, continuous bands. The National Weather Service started issuing multi-day rainfall warnings. The Hatchie River gauge upstream was rising. The gauge downstream was already past flood stage. Every farmer along County Road 7 had seen this pattern before, and every one of them knew what it meant for the Callaway farm specifically. It sat in the lowest pocket of the whole basin. Ruby had heard that fact her entire life, from neighbors, from the extension agent, from strangers who took one look at the property and shook their heads. She spent those days working through a list she'd made back in March, when she first saw the seasonal outlook. Equipment moved to higher ground, seed stored, the irrigation pump hauled up into the barn loft. Her father settled in the house, too fragile now for the work itself, but his eyes still sharp when she came in each evening covered in mud. "You ready?" he asked her one night, the rain just starting to tap the window glass. "I think so," she said. She wasn't entirely sure that was true. By Friday, the sky had gone the color of a cast-iron skillet, and the rain stopped tapping. It arrived. It fell for 4 days straight. Not the kind of hard downpour that announces itself and passes, but something worse. A patient, relentless soaking that didn't rush and didn't let up. The smell of cold mud settling over everything it touched. By Sunday, Cane Branch was out of its banks. By Monday morning, the lower third of every field on the east side of County Road 7 was underwater, and the Hatchie crested 11 feet above flood stage at the county road crossing, the highest water anyone had seen there in over a decade. Ruby stood at the edge of her low field in rubber boots soaked through to her knees, watching the river do exactly what everyone always said it would. She had no idea yet whether 60 feet of grass and a dead man's notebook were about to hold, or whether the whole season was about to be proven a costly mistake. The water that came down Cane Branch reached the lower edge of the Callaway field and met the strip Ruby had refused to plow. It did not stop. The current was far too strong for that, and Ruby had never claimed otherwise. But it slowed. The root mass of the native grass grabbed at the silt. The dense, undisturbed vegetation absorbed the first surge of force, instead of letting it pass straight through. The water spread sideways across the grass instead of charging up into the planted rows behind it. Around the Callaway place, the news was worse by the hour. Dale Huckett lost nearly 30 acres of corn to standing water that wouldn't drain. Tom Puett's soybean field took a sheet of silt across it he wouldn't know the full cost of until July. Burl Simmons watched a section of creek bank he'd spent 15 years building simply give way and disappear into the current. Ruby stood at the edge of her field and watched the line where the water decided what it would take. She didn't know yet what it had spared. By Tuesday, the rain had thinned to a drizzle, and Ruby walked the strip in the gray morning light. The planted field above the grass had drained in hours. The crop showed stress, but nothing had died. And the silt, that pale, hardened band that should have crossed the rows and cost weeks of work to clear, stopped dead at the edge of the grass and went no farther. Compared to her neighbors, the difference wasn't subtle. Burl's adjacent field had taken nearly 3 inches of deposited silt across its lower quarter. Tom Puett was looking at a 60-acre replant. Dale's drainage tile had simply been overwhelmed. The Callaway low field, the ground everyone in the county agreed sat in the worst possible spot in the whole basin, had come through with the least damage of any comparable acreage along the river. 60 years after Earl Callaway wrote it down by lamplight and shelved it for someone to eventually find, his notebook had been proven right in the space of 4 days. They came one at a time over the next 2 weeks, not as a group, not with any apology in their step, but the way farmers come when they need to understand something quietly. Burl Simmons came first, 4 days after the water pulled back, walking slow with his boots still caked from his own ruined creek bank. He stood at the edge of the grass strip a long time before he spoke. "I need you to tell me what you did here," he said. Ruby told him plainly. 60 feet, native grass and sedge and switchgrass. Nothing planted, just left alone to do what it already knew how to do. Dale came 2 days later, Tom the day after that. The county extension agent walked the strip with a measuring tape, and Ruby showed him her grandfather's journals without impatience. Nobody laughed this time. The following spring, 3 farms along County Road 7 put in buffer strips of their own. 2 years on, aerial photographs of the basin showed more than 1,000 linear feet of new grass running where plowed ground used to be. Her father was on the porch the afternoon the extension agent left, wrapped in a blanket despite the June warmth, watching the road the way he'd watched it for 40 years. Ruby told him how the conversations had gone. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandfather would have liked you." It wasn't a complicated thing to say. It was the right thing, and it landed the way right things do. The same porch, the same 2 people, but nothing about that ground felt uncertain anymore. Earl Calloway spent decades watching water move across that farm, writing it down for no one in particular, and the world moved on without him long enough that his own notebook sat untouched in a shed for 60 years. If there's someone in your family who paid that kind of attention, to land, to weather, to the small things nobody else thought worth writing down, go find what they left behind. It might still be waiting on the right person to read it.